Good morning, everybody. I'm Perry Bacon. I'm the host of Right Now, New Republic's video cast on politics, policy, and the Trump administration. I'm honored to be joined today by Julie Margetta Morgan, who is the president of the Century Foundation. We'll get into more what the Century Foundation does in a bit, but I welcome Julie, first of all.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So most of the week, and most of the last 7 months, I've been very focused on kind of Trump talking about like Trump firing Lisa Cook or things that are like maybe in the authoritarian playbook, talking about him, not respecting independent agencies, trying to take power, things that are sort of in this sort of democracy bucket. I think those things are all important. But a lot of the work you all are doing is on the sort of actual impact on the policies in a sort of material day to day way. So I want to talk about that some and move away. I mean, we'll come back to some of the sort of authoritarian stuff, but I want to talk about the specifics right now a little bit. And so some authoritarians are actually quite good at running the economy or being popular and making goods cheaper and so on. This is not that what Donald Trump is doing, right? In some ways, costs are
Yeah.
going up in a variety of ways. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think we're seeing this in a couple of ways. Donald Trump ran for president on the idea that he would bring down costs for working families, and we're seeing the exact opposite. I think first we saw this with the doging of agencies that had a direct impact on people's lives. So I was an employee at the CFPB. I was a political appointee, so I resigned before the agency was shuttered. But we had this effective shuttering of the CFPB that started almost immediately after his inauguration. And that's an agency that provided direct services to people to put money back in their pockets. So, you have that side of the cost of living piece here where there's no one, to call if your credit report is inaccurate and it's keeping you from getting a loan. There's no one to call if you have debt collectors coming after you for a medical bill that you don't owe. And we actually saw the Trump administration going back and unwinding settlements that had been secured by the prior administration that would put money back in people's pockets. So we've got that side of the cost of living. And then we've got the things the president is doing that are really directly driving up costs for families. So one part of that is the tariffs, which the Century Foundation and Groundwork Collaborative have been tracking pretty closely, including, the increased cost of just the items that people need to send their kids back to school. And then there's the cost of healthcare, food, education that the Trump administration and Republicans in Congress took a big swing at in their reconciliation bill, where they drove up those costs for average families across the board. And, it's obviously some of these impacts are going to come over time, but we're seeing it right away. We're seeing people have trouble paying their bills. We've got 1 in 4 people skipping meals to pay their bills. And I thought one of the interesting things in our polling was that we're seeing that people understand that this is coming from the Trump administration. Like 6 in 10 people are blaming Donald Trump for these increased costs.
Let me give some specifics here. Talk about you mentioned kids in school. There are some details here about prices going up. You can talk about.
Yeah, sure. So we took a look at the prices that people are paying to go back to school, and that's everything from, the price of sneakers, clothes, colored pencils, index cards, laptops, and they're going up across the board. It really depends on the specific product, how much, but for certain laptops that are very common for kids in public schools as well as for college students, prices are up as much as 10%. For things like paper supplies, costs are going up. We also looked at the cost of lunch supplies because that's an ongoing cost, right? Maybe the sneakers are a one-time purchase, but people are going to be purchasing lunch supplies week to week, and those costs are up about 5%. So it's really hitting families pretty hard. And we're doing some work also to look at how people are coping with those costs, right? Some of it's coming out of their weekly paycheck, but some of it they're having to put on debt products like credit cards or buy now, pay later.
You mentioned healthcare. So, the bill passed, the big, beautiful, I hate to even use that phrase, the domestic policy bill that they pushed through passed. It has some long term changes in Medicaid. Is there anything happening immediately in terms of healthcare costs that we should know about?
So the immediate effects that we're looking at are the costs of premiums going up for where the tax credits are expiring. So our team is tracking that pretty closely. We're
These are
finding
tax credits that were passed in the Biden administration.
exactly.
Okay.
These are the tax credits from the original tax bill.
Okay.
Um, So those tax credits are going to expire. Premiums are going to increase on millions of families across the country. My team is tracking this pretty closely, and we're finding that it's really going to hit rural communities quite hard. So that's something that I think is an important impact to track. The other piece that we've been working on, I worked on this at CFPB, and we're working on it at the Century Foundation too, is that with the high deductible health plans, people were already incurring pretty significant costs for their medical care. And then they were already incurring kind of the tricks and traps of the insurance industry, kind of getting trapped between their healthcare provider, their insurance provider, and then these third party debt collectors who come after them for the debt. So I think that's something that we want to pay attention to as well. People were already struggling with the costs of their healthcare, and we have this kind of we see this in a lot of different industries where people are squeezed. You all of a sudden see these financial products being kind of like popping up as like, hey, don't worry about it. Congress doesn't need to solve this problem. I've got a solution. And
Yeah.
the solution is, a high interest credit card or an installment loan to pay for your dental care.
There are all these parts of the Trump domestic policy bill that'll make it harder to pay for college, but those are also like more long term. Are we seeing that already in terms of students being leery of being able to pay for college? Because a lot of the things in there will make it more expensive over time.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing people be leery of paying for college, and I think part of that is because we're seeing so many people struggle with their existing student loan debt. This is something we were trying to tackle in the Biden administration, but for a variety of reasons, from attending a for-profit college that scammed the person into paying for something that didn't materialize, or being kind of given the runaround by their student loan servicer. People are really struggling to pay back this debt. And like I said, the Biden administration, first of all, we canceled a lot of loans under the Biden administration, which is something I was really proud of. But they also tried to put in place payment plans that would make it easier for people to pay back their loans. The courts have attempted to squash those plans. The Trump administration is rolling back those plans. And so I think families are seeing, it's an incredibly risky investment at this point to send your child to college. And on top of that, there's some uncertainty of whether the jobs will pay off in the end. I think families are really feeling that or questioning the impact of AI on their ability to pay their bills after they've gone to college. So there's this big squeeze on families, and then the Trump bill will just kind of kick that into high gear in the coming years.
So there's two economic stories going on from what I can tell. Is like one is you're suggesting that the tariffs themselves are right or are bringing costs up, and the second is that their agenda is both not helping in affordability and sort of normal problems and also exacerbating them. So like the tariffs are one issue and the domestic policy agenda is probably a separate issue, but they are both making it harder for the average family.
Yeah, and I think those are just the tip of the iceberg. Those are the things that get the most attention. But we're seeing the Department of Labor, roll back rules that the Biden administration put in place to support higher wages for home health care workers. There are a variety of these other actions that are being taken across the board that are really, to me, part of just kind of like a larger war on the working class. This is an administration that has pretty clearly put a stake in the ground that they're here for the wealthiest Americans. They're here to make more money for billionaires and the biggest businesses. And they're doing that by undercutting the rest of us.
War on the working class. Like I think the narrative has been that the Democrats are the party of the college graduate and the Republicans are the party of the working person. And I'm making fun of this a little bit, but like, is that story getting? I mean, how do you tell that story? And like, I think it's an important one. Is like this is an administration that is fighting a war on the working class. You said you've done some polling. Are people getting that story? Because I know the media is covering the authoritarianism, which I think is important. But are people getting the message? There's also a war on the working class happening.
I do think people are getting the message. I mean, we saw in our polling that people understood that Trump is the person who's driving these higher costs for them. So they really were blaming Republicans and Donald Trump in particular for their higher cost of living. So I think it's getting through, but I do think it's incumbent on the rest of us to actually be doing the math. We get pulled so quickly into what's the kind of fight of the day and what's like the next outrageous thing that the Trump administration is doing. But we have to do that math across all the actions that they're taking and how they're adding up for families. Some of the way we're doing that at the Century Foundation is by looking at debt, because that's a lot of the way that this kind of lands on families. And in my mind, it's one of the things that often gets missed. So when people look at larger economic indicators of, how many jobs are there, what does consumption look like, what they're missing out on is how this really feels for families, which is basically like I'm maxing out my credit card to pay my bills, then I'm taking on a buy now, pay later loan to afford my grocery bills. And then, maybe like I can't pay those debts. And so I'm taking on a small loan from my employer to get me from one paycheck to the other. And I think one of the things here that we really need to kind of hammer home for families is that, or for people in general, is that it feels like a scam, right? It's like the way working class people are interacting with the economy right now is that they're kind of getting scammed at every turn. Like something that you used to buy is now a subscription. Your credit card is taking a little extra off the top in interest rates. They're selling you on rewards that don't materialize. There's a junk fee for basically everything you purchase these days. So I think we have to bring that point home too.
So the average American is doing better than the average person in country X and better than their grandparents were, right? So how do we explain this? It's not that people are starving in large. Well, there are people starving. I shouldn't say there are, but it's not. But for the average American, probably it's like costs are going up and their wages are not keeping up. Is that the right way to think about this?
Yeah, I don't think it feels for people like they're doing better than their grandparents did. And I think, honestly, when we focus just on the wages piece of it and not on their larger cost of living, it obscures some of that because, you see people on TV saying like wages are going up, kind of like
Right,
a
right.
what's the problem, right?
CNBC, right? Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
But when it's landing on families as like, I'm one health crisis away from being underwater, or I'm one car accident away from being underwater, it really doesn't feel that way. I think a lot of people feel like they're living kind of on the edge of precarity, and in ways that they ought not, based on kind of having like followed all the rules and gotten the jobs that people said would be the strong middle class jobs. They're feeling precarity in a way that doesn't feel kind of like the deal that they thought they were signing up for.
You mentioned like it was a good thing that Biden forgave college debt. I think that became a controversial idea, not just among conservatives. Like, explain like why it was useful to forgive college debt and what we should think about in terms of. I think one thing has become like the new thing I'm hearing in the left, center left, is that too many people are going to college. The problem is not forgiving college debt; it's making sure only people. We don't. And I agree that everyone should not go to college if they don't want to, but I think I'm leery we're moving to a zone of only the rich or the upper income will go to college, which is how it used to be, and only the white. And you get the point here. So, why is forgiving college debt good? And then what should our sort of college affordability agenda be?
Oh man, you said a lot of things there that I I
Yes.
want to respond to.
All right. Fair enough.
First, just generally in terms of where the Trump administration is taking our higher education policy, I do think that this assault on elite university is it's framed in a lot of different ways, but it is basically trying to turn these schools into kind of like whites only social clubs for the friends' children. And I think for the rest of us, they'd be very happy for us to have these kind of like short-term credentials that look like the cheap version of a college education for everyone else. And I think when we talk about like does everyone need to go to college, the bottom line is that even though the earnings of a college degree are not going up, the earnings of not having a college degree have gone down over time, right? So it's become less and less affordable or realistic for people to not get some kind of post-secondary education. So I think it's really incumbent on us to kind of figure out a way to make that as affordable and accessible for people as possible, and to stop kind of getting hung up on this question of like, is it elite or not, that's based on these stereotypes of like an ivy covered campus and just, remember that people need this post-secondary education. Um, on the loan forgiveness piece, there were kind of two strains of loan forgiveness that were pursued under the Biden administration. The pieces that went through were largely related to making the programs that we had promised to people, that Congress had promised to people, actually work. So when we got on the ground in the Biden administration, we found that we had these programs like public service loan forgiveness that promised forgiveness after 10 years of public service, or income-based repayment that promised forgiveness after 20 or 25 years of paying your loan. The servicers had like not been minding the store on those programs. They had been lying to borrowers. They had been messing up the payment counts. They had been doing things like, this is my favorite example. So the regulations around public service loan forgiveness said that you had to make your actual monthly payment, so as stated on your bill. But if you used auto pay, it would round up or down by a couple of pennies when you made the payment, and that wasn't considered to be making your stated payment on your bill. So people who used auto pay over 10 years and thought that they were working towards public service forgiveness had made basically no progress at
Oh,
all.
okay.
So those are the places where we went in and fixed the problems in the program and gave the people the forgiveness that they deserved. So it was really about kind of keeping the bargain of those programs. The larger forgiveness programs were really aimed at the economic impact of this debt on all of us and on kind of our country's future. I think that's the place we need to keep focusing, because that debt is holding, millions and millions of families back.
So the ideal scenario is you can get a higher education without going into debt or a large amount of debt. That's where we should be headed, right?
I think that's right. And I think the other lesson we learned in the Biden administration is that any of these kind of like intricate programs where you take on a loan and you have to depend on someone over time tracking that, we should be deeply skeptical of those. So we really need to focus on those like big, simple solutions for families.
So, since you work in the administration, Biden administration, I do want to ask, like, how do like I left it being thinking that a lot of great policies were passed and a lot of the policies we've been pushing for a long time, maybe smaller versions of them, but then maybe I hoped, but he was not that popular, and I guess does that mean the sort of populist Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden agenda is not popular, or are we? What do you, how should we sort of think about those? A lot of policies I like passed, and I worried we left them thinking that maybe those policies the voters don't like them. I sort of think voters do care about cost of living, and there were policies to help them and forgiving loans, trying to add more jobs in the Midwest, and trying to create a lot of clean energy jobs. A lot of things that I wanted, they didn't happen at the scale maybe we all want, but we got Congress, we've got Joe Manchin. But I mean, but so is there some disconnect that we should think about?
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, the only disconnect is, could we go as far as we needed to go to actually fix these problems for people? I think the Biden administration did a lot of amazing work. They did pass a lot of, or, implement a lot of really good policies. But the scale of the problem that people are facing is just so massive. I think, we have this period of time right now where we really need to be thinking deeply about what we can do to actually get in there and fix some of these longer standing problems for families, like, their cost of housing, cost of healthcare, cost of higher education. And that's both on the kind of legislative side that you mentioned, but also, what can we do administratively to bring some real results for people that they can feel in their bank account and around their kitchen table.
Without getting into to elections too much, like is there something we learned from the New York race, you think, in terms of, is that kind of campaigning, is it effective because people are feeling these kind of costs?
Well, I mean, I think we learned that people still have an appetite for really big ideas that solve their problems, right? I think we learned that cost of living is just as top of mind as we thought it would be for voters right now. I think the other thing I'm taking away from watching that election really closely is that people don't just want to see us say, "Oh, hey, I've got a solution to your housing problem, and it's like, millions of dollars, and it'll come down the line, and like, we'll see you later." I think people understand, they see the kind of power dynamics in the economy that are stacked against them. And so I think they really want to see policymakers take that on. So when they're talking about housing solutions or solutions on even issues like childcare, they want to see us say, we've got a way for the government to help you, but we're also going to take on the corporate actors or the powerful actors who are creating the situation that you're feeling every day.
So maybe creating abundance, but also fighting oligarchy, to use some phrases that are out there right now.
Yeah, I think when you look at what Mamdani is saying about rental housing, for example, he's talking about holding down prices, but he's also talking about accountability for landlords, and I think people want to see both sides of that coin.
Before you got on, you and I were talking about not living in big cities. I live in Louisville, which is not tiny, but not living in the sort of huge coast cities. I live in Louisville. You live near Springfield.
I do, yeah.
So talk about how you see the economy maybe differently than you did when you lived in DC.
Well, I mean, I think living out here gives me we were talking a little bit about housing. I think it gives you a better sense that, when you live in a place like DC or New York, you can get a sense that your house is an investment that grows over time. And so if you overpay a little bit, like, all right, it'll kind of bear out over time. Here, that's an incredibly risky thing for families, right? If you overpay on the price of your home, particularly at the interest rates that we're facing right now, it can be pretty catastrophic over time. And then, I think the conversation about things like universal childcare or even just expansion of childcare or like public schooling hit differently in smaller places where the budgets are a little bit tighter and then people have organized their lives in different ways to cope with those problems. So in a big city, you have a lot of private services that have popped up because you have a lot of families who are facing the same problem. Here it's a little bit different. It's a little bit tighter. We were talking about the cost of childcare, and it's just very different in a place where there are more single earner homes, but single earner homes also can be more precarious, right, than two earner homes. So it feels a little bit different out here.
Does that point to more sort of local policy solutions? Does that point to everyone gets $10,000 voucher, they can do whatever they want to with it? What does that sort of point to in the sort of because you're doing national policy, but we're agreeing that the geography of where the policy happens matters. What does that point you in any direction?
I mean, I think it points to policy solutions that aren't one size fits all and that really accommodate those different things, but maybe not in the way that sometimes has landed on Capitol Hill, where like Capitol Hill sort of separates out like rural, as in like 2,000 people in a small town from the rest of
Right, right, right,
America.
right.
I think we need policies that accommodate kind of a broader spectrum. There's a lot of people who are living in places that have 100,000 or 200,000 people, and we need to think about policy solutions that work for them too.
Let me finish here, which is like, we're telling the authoritarianism story. You're talking about a war on the working class. Are these things, is there a way that these stories are connected? Maybe they aren't.
I mean, I think what we're finding right now, you raised this in the beginning that, authoritarianism in some ways can read as kind of like a strong man who can be laser focused on solving the problems of the people in their community. I think what we're finding is that certainly not the case here, and perhaps maybe always not the case.
Right.
So I think that there was probably an assumption in the election that the kind of like authoritarian tough talk could be used on behalf of the working class, and I think we're seeing the actual opposite, that we have a president who is using his authoritarian instincts to enrich himself and to enrich his kind of friends and colleagues, in a way that just has like utter disregard for the working class.
Okay. I think I'm going to close it there. Any reports you all are doing, anything you want to tell the audience in some way, anything you want to, I think plug feels like a very light word, but anything that's happening at Century Foundation we should know about?
I would love, if anyone's interested, please check out the polling that we did with Morning Consult on how families are coping with the affordability crisis we're facing right now. The back to school research I mentioned is up on our website too. And then, like I said, we're doing a lot on the cost of healthcare premiums. So that's something, there's a couple of things up already, and then stay tuned for more in the future.
Julie, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for watching. Bye bye.